All right. So before we kind of get going here today, a couple things I wanted to mention. Um, First is CL sessions, or kind of as kind of usual since the exam, or it'll be tonight and then Monday. So just to kind of clarify, and I've tried to do this multiple times, but both of those are covering Module 7 material. So our weeks don't really run from Monday to Sunday; they run from Tuesday to Monday, right? So the Thursday and Monday sessions before we meet in class on Tuesday both cover what we covered this week, Module 7. So if you attend either one of those, you can get the extra credit for the week. Okay. So the weeks kind of always reset on Tuesdays for us. I also put up an announcement. One of the links in the Canvas discussion, when I originally accessed it, I didn't realize I was on my IU account, and I have a subscription through the university, have a subscription to the website. You don't. And so it was showing you that it was behind the paywall. So I basically just found a summary of the article and kind of posted that and put that in the link instead. So that Harvard Review article, now the link in the Canvas discussion should actually send you to what that article was about. If you've already done kind of your post, that's okay. I had multiple articles up there that you could have responded to some of the questions on. But just in case you were curious about the article or you wanted to use it, you haven't done that discussion yet, that's now kind of fixed on there on Canvas. Okay. So that's due by the end of the day when? Friday. You need your initial post, mentioning and tying the data into that post, and 2 replies to other students. Okay. You need all 4 of those things. Okay. I also updated the practice problems just a little bit, and I'll mention something today as we work through material that I'm not going to expect you to know. So if you've downloaded those, I would kind of download them again. It was really like 2 questions I adjusted just a little bit. You might not even notice it. The correct answer didn't change, but there was something in those 2 of the problems that I'm not going to expect you to know on this week's quiz. Also, to reiterate, subsidies are not going to be covered on this week's quiz either. So you won't see any subsidy questions on those practice problems. That was kind of from last week's module, so you'll be expected to know them for the exam, but it kind of limits the material that you need to know this week just to everything we covered after subsidies or just externalities. Okay. Other than that, that should take care of all the housekeeping stuff. After class today, you'll see that next module quiz pop up. I say after class, after both of my sections, so around 11 a.m. You'll see the module 8 reading pop up. We're going to kind of pivot a little bit. We'll still be building on things we talked about, but module 8 and 9 are going to look a little bit different than what we've kind of been doing the last few weeks. Okay. So I think that should cover everything before we jump into material here, which we'll dive in pretty quickly. Any questions for me before we get started? Okay. So, and I think I had someone ask this in class, and I thought this was known, but I don't think every student knows this. If you want to follow along with me on the slides, if you pull them up on Canvas, it opens them up in your web browser. You can't view the animations. So if you're wanting to kind of, when I'm clicking through, especially when we were talking about like producer consumer surplus, and I was kind of overlapping those areas, showing those shapes. When you just look at the slides on a web browser, it'll just show you like what the final result of that slide was. If you want to work along with me, or you want to go back to them and kind of look through like what the step-by-step was, you need to download them to your device and then actually open it up in PowerPoint. The PowerPoint capabilities on Canvas are a little limited, right? And so if you want to kind of work through these slides again, or you want to work along with me, I would download them and then actually open them up in PowerPoint as opposed to in Canvas. Okay. So with that being said, kind of jump back into where we left off. So we were talking about negative and positive externalities. So before we even look at the slides, I'm going to do things a little bit different, just to kind of remind us where we left off, and then I think it makes the discussion of taxes and subsidies a little bit better, a little bit easier. So last class, we said we were kind of thinking about if there was a market, we know that the market arrives at the equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand. So one subscript I'll start using, instead of just thinking about this as the equilibrium, we'll think about this as like the quantity the market gets to. Okay. Now the market doesn't factor in additional costs or benefits, right? It doesn't factor in these negative or positive externalities. So if I have a negative externality, if you look at the book or you use ChatGPT, it might tell you can model it 2 ways. I'm trying to simplify things for you, so you're only ever going to have to model it one way when it comes to the quiz or the exam. So what is a negative externality? we said it's an additional what? Or an external, if it's a bad thing, it is a cost or benefit. Cost, right? So our negative externalities, we were thinking about, there's some additional cost to society. So the cost to society are not the private marginal costs. They'll include those, right? Whatever the cost of producing that good was, but they're also going to include whatever this additional cost to society is. So at every single quantity, if we could come up with a per unit cost to this negative externality, we said our marginal social costs will be whatever those marginal costs were, plus whatever the value of that negative externality was, or that external cost, the people outside the market. So we were always modeling negative externalities. If there are additional costs, what represents costs? Supply or demand? Supply, right? So we were always modeling it through the supply curve. That's an easier way to think about it. Doesn't matter if they're negative consumption or production externalities. We still model them through the supply curve. You can model them through the demand curve, and we have time to show you that, but I'm not going to expect you to do that. Okay? So we said, where is the efficient point for society? Well, we don't have any positive externalities in this example. So our marginal benefits to the consumers, those are our social benefits as well. There's no positive, there's no external benefits, there's no positive externalities. So where would society want the equilibrium to be? Or what's the efficient point for society? Well, it's where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, but for society, it's where that marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So that's going to be at this quantity down here. So we said with negative externalities, the people in the market don't factor in things like pollution. They don't factor in these additional costs. So if they're not including the additional costs, they're going to do too much. Right? When the market's out here at this quantity, for every unit past the socially efficient point, what's true about the marginal social benefit relative to the marginal social cost? It's lower. So if we think about kind of like total surplus to society, that would be the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social cost. It's still the way we were defining total surplus before. It's now we're looking at not the market, we're looking at society. So every unit past this point, we said the cost to society are greater than the benefits. So this represented what? A loss of surplus to society or deadweight loss. Okay. Now, if society wants a quantity that's lower, we said, another less technical way of remembering this is our deadweight loss triangle. We want less of it. It's going to point to the left. So we have a problem, right? The market is creating deadweight loss for society. Not creating deadweight loss in the market, but it's creating deadweight loss for society overall. So if we want less of something, what is a tool that we have? I can tax people, right? So I could tax producers and consumers, and I'll show you both ways. But probably the easier way, and the way that you really only need to think about modeling it, if I want to impose a cost, I could use a tax. If I tax producers, what's going to happen to the supply curve? It's going to decrease. So how can I get the supply curve to match up to that marginal social cost? I would take that supply curve and add a tax. What's the optimal value of the tax to add? Whatever the value of that external cost is. If I could get a tax that was exactly equal to that negative externalities value or exactly equal to that external cost, I can get my supply curve plus the tax to match up with society's marginal cost curve. Now, where does the market choose? Well, the new supply curve with the tax is up here. Now the market, after that tax, is going to choose that socially efficient point. So if we want less of something, we can impose a tax on the producers and force that supply curve so that it matches up with our society's supply curve. So I usually don't call it this, but the marginal social cost, you could also kind of think about this. It's like society's supply curve, right? It's factoring in all the costs, not just to the producers, but to society overall. So this is how taxes would solve our negative externality issue. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Now, I'm going to try to draw this to scale right below it. And this is where I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know how to do this, but just to kind of solidify this idea and to answer some questions you might be having. So I want this to kind of be at the same point as the above. So here we think about this is where the market was before. If I have a negative externality, I said we're always going to model this through our supply curve. So our marginal social costs at every quantity, the cost of society are higher. So we said society wants the quantity to be lower. So what happens instead if I didn't tax producers? That was the easier way to think about it because I can shift that supply curve to perfectly match up with society's supply curve or the marginal social cost. But we said before, when it comes to like producer and consumer surplus and deadweight loss, does it matter if I tax the producers or consumers? No, it's going to have a negative impact still on both producers and consumers, and it would cause deadweight loss in the market. So a similar idea here, if I want to fix the negative externality example, situation, I could tax producers, right? Or I could tax consumers. Now, it's a little bit more complicated if I tax consumers, at least the visual, because if I tax consumers, what am I shifting? Consumers, so I'd be shifting demand. If I tax them, do they want to do more or less than before? Buy more or less. So I'm going to have a demand decrease, right? That tax is an additional cost, so it lowers the consumer's marginal benefit. So where is my new equilibrium point after this tax? Where would supply be equal to my new demand curve? At that efficient point for society. So if I use the same tax, as long as it's equal to the value of that external cost, I get the same result in the market. Doesn't matter if I tax consumers or producers. Now, when you're drawing this out for yourself, probably an easier way to remember why taxes fix the negative externality situation is drawing it through the supply curve, right? Because there you can kind of easily see, oh yeah, I can get supply to match up with the marginal social costs. If I tax consumers, it still solves the problem. It just looks a little bit more complicated, right? But it still moves me to that same efficient point for society. So it would still eliminate the deadweight loss that existed because of this negative externality. So I'm showing this to you. Comes to the quiz and the exam, I would model things only in this way that we did at the time. That's all you should need. Any questions?
Shifted demand, where would the demand be?
So this might be a good point. What is the total surplus to society? It's the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social cost to society. So if I tax this product, I no longer have this deadweight loss to society because what is total surplus now? At the efficient point for society, the difference between my marginal social benefit and my marginal social cost is right here. I've eliminated that deadweight loss. Okay. Same thing down here. What's the difference between my marginal social benefits? I don't have any positive externalities, so it's just the demand curve. So that difference between my marginal social benefits and marginal social costs, same exact area. I've eliminated that deadweight loss using the tax. So you can kind of think about what does this green area represent? It's total surplus to society if I use that tax to get to that socially efficient point. Any other questions on this before we continue? Okay. So we kind of have this idea, right, that taxes can solve this negative externality issue. So we're going to call this a corrective tax, right? So what is the ideal corrective tax? We said, if I could figure out exactly what that per unit external cost was from this negative externality, the tax I want to use would be exactly equal to that. Because it would then shift my supply curve the exact same amount as that external cost shifted society's supply curve, or it would make my marginal social cost match up with the producer's costs. So if I can make that match up, producers will start making decisions as though they are society, as though they face society's marginal cost. So the ideal kind of tax would be exactly equal to whatever that value of that negative externality was. Right? Now, on the flip side, and we'll draw this out in a second, if I have a positive externality, that means people weren't factoring in these additional benefits. So the market actually produced two. So negative externalities, we said the market was at a quantity that was too high. So it's external benefits, the market is going to arrive at a quantity that's too low. So if society wants more of something, what's one way I could push the market to a higher quantity? Instead of using taxes, I could use subsidies. Right? So taxes will fix our negative externality issue. Subsidies will fix our positive externality issue. Okay? So we can kind of think about, we'll also look through what we would call taxes and subsidies. It would be market-based policies. We are making producers or consumers what we call internalize those additional costs or benefits so that they start making decisions as though those additional costs or benefits are their own. In fact, we make them their own because they have to now pay a tax, which is an additional cost, or they're given a subsidy, which is an additional benefit. Now, we also have command and control policies. We don't see this as often in countries like the United States, but if we kind of go back to communism, countries with communist regimes, they have what we call like a command and control economy. They just tell the producers exactly how much to produce, right? So one other thing that we could think about with negative externalities before we kind of move on to positive externalities is if I have a negative externality, so our market makes the decision based off of where supply is equal to demand. But if we have negative externalities, we said the cost to society are actually higher, and society wants a lower quantity. So just to reiterate, why does deadweight loss exist when the market produces a quantity that is too high or we have overproduction? Because the total surplus to society, once again, when we were looking at producers, consumers, or total surplus, surplus is always the difference between marginal benefits and the marginal costs. Now, when we're looking at producers versus consumers, those marginal benefits, marginal costs, the price to consumers was the marginal. Buy something that is your marginal. If I go into the store, I'm a consumer, what's the marginal cost to me? Price. If I'm a producer, what was my marginal benefit? I sell something, the benefit to me as a firm is the price. But at its core, we were still looking at just the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost. It was just, we were kind of making it specific to consumers versus producers. If we want to know what surplus exists for society, it's still the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. It's just now we're looking at society's marginal benefit and society's marginal costs. So when the market produces out here, every unit in this range, what's true about V? Well, if I don't have any positive externalities, demand just represents my marginal social benefit. But with these negative externalities, my marginal social cost is not the supply curve, it's actually higher. So for every unit in this range, if the marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits to society, what will be true? This represents surplus that is positive or negative. Well, if my marginal social costs are greater than my marginal social benefits, the units in this range, the total surplus would be negative, subtracting a larger value. So this was going to be our kind of deadweight loss. We said taxes could fix this issue, but if I'm got my iron boot on the neck of the producers here, and I don't have to rely on these taxes and subsidies, market-based policies, I can just say, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to send in the military. They're going to, take it over. Well, what could I do? Instead of using a tax, I could just impose if I want the quantity to be lower, I could just say, here's this quota, right? I'm not going to allow you to produce past a certain point. So we can use taxes to solve that negative externality issue. But if we wanted a lower quantity, we could also use a quota. We could limit the quantity this market produces. And that would push us back down to that socially efficient point as well. So we kind of have two tools there that we talked about to solve the negative externality issue. Any questions on this idea? Okay. So what if instead we have positive externalities? Okay, so this is where we're kind of getting some review, but we're also going to connect this to what we're talking about today. So if I got a market, supply and demand, here's the market price and quantity, or the equilibrium price and quantity that the producers and consumers kind of arrive at. If I have a positive externality, that means that there are some additional or external what? Benefits. So we said demand represents marginal benefits, supply represents marginal costs. So what would society's marginal benefit be if we have a positive externality? Well, it would include the marginal benefits to consumers, but it now also includes these external benefits that exist to people outside of the market. So at every single quantity for society, the marginal benefit is whatever it was before, plus an additional amount. So we said at every quantity, we now have society's marginal benefits are higher. Now, we don't have any negative externalities, so our marginal costs and our marginal social costs are the same thing, kind of the opposite of negative externalities. With negative externalities, society's benefits were the same as the private or consumer's marginal benefits. Or sorry, with taxes, yeah, sorry, I said that right. But with positive externalities, the private marginal cost just ends up being society's cost, right? There's no additional cost, we only have additional benefits. So where is our new, or I shouldn't say our new equilibrium, but where would the efficient point for society be? At this higher quantity. Now, similar to taxes, if taxes are additional costs, I always model that through my supply curve because it represents costs. How am I modeling positive externalities? Through my demand curve, because demand represents marginal benefits. Additional benefits, positive externalities, we're going to model that kind of through that demand curve. And I think it'll make a little more sense when we talk about subsidies as to why. You can model it through the supply curve, just like I showed you earlier. It doesn't matter how you model those negative externalities, you still get the same result. But I'm only ever going to expect you to know how to model them through the demand curve. So this is how we would do it. So once again, a little bit of review. But if the market is underproducing, right? The market is producing a quantity that's below that efficient point for society. What is the total surplus to society? Simply the difference between society's marginal. Once again, we have to know how to find surplus. It's the difference between marginal benefits. So if I want society's surplus, society's marginal benefits, the difference between that and marginal cost. In this case, we want society's total surplus, so society's marginal costs. So when the market stops here, for every unit in this range, what was true about the surplus? It would have been, well, if the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost to society, this all would have been positive total surplus, but the market stopped here. So we're not realizing all of that surplus, or we're missing out on it. So that's our deadweight loss. Once again, less technical, but for every unit that the market is underproducing, that's where our deadweight loss is created. We want a higher quantity for society, so our deadweight loss triangle points to the right. I want a higher quantity there. Okay. So how can we fix this issue? Well, if I want more of something, we said I can use a subsidy. The easiest way to think about this is how can I get that demand curve to match up with exactly what society's marginal benefit curve is? Or I can almost think about this as society's demand curve. So what would I want to do? Well, if I've got demand representing marginal benefit, how do I get my new demand curve to match up with society's demand curve or society's marginal benefit? I would use a subsidy that's exactly equal to the value of that positive externality. If I do that, my new demand curve plus the subsidy is exactly equal to society's marginal benefits. Now, where does the market choose to be? Well, it's almost like I had a demand increase. The market now chooses this higher quantity. Now my quantity with the subsidy is exactly where society's kind of efficient quantity would be. I've now gotten this higher, I've eliminated that deadweight loss. So with negative externalities, we can use taxes to eliminate society's deadweight loss. Positive externalities, we want more of something. How do I get more of something? I subsidize that good. If I do that, I can get the society's efficient quantity and eliminate my deadweight loss there. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep?
The Q, do you have stuff about
Yeah, so we can think about, I said, these really represent the equilibrium price and quantity of the market. The reason why I start using the subscript of M here is because we want to make a differentiation between where the equilibrium, or the point that would maximize the market's total surplus, is different from the quantity that would maximize society's total surplus. So that's why, once we got externalities, instead of E, I'll start using M to kind of, I don't know, help solidify this idea that this is where the market is, here's where society is. Does that answer your question? Any other questions we've got here? Okay. Where are we at on time? So what I don't want to do, and I know I did this for taxes, I don't want to overcomplicate this or give you too much, which is why I said it doesn't matter if they're consumption or production externalities. We will always model negative externalities through the supply. I showed you, you can model them. Sorry, I haven't shown you yet. You can model them through the demand curve and get the same result, but I'm not going to expect you to do that. Similar idea with subsidies. We're always going to model, subsidies. Positive externalities, we're always going to model those through the demand curve. You can model them through the supply curve. I'm not going to expect you to know how to do that. If we have time at the end of the class, I think I'll kind of show you this. But if I am you, the only questions you'll be expected to answer are modeling it this way. If you do model it the other way and you model it correctly, you could still arrive at the same answer. It's just I haven't shown that to you. I'm not going to expect you to know how to do that. Also, if you're looking at like help files, or using AI to come up with additional questions, and some of the questions that I removed, just to kind of make this point, what I'm not going to ask you questions on. So let's say I have that same example. So here's where the market is. Here was my positive externality. What you'll start to see if you look at other questions outside of this course is I've really focused on that when I'm looking at the efficient point for society, what have I don't think up to this point, I've never drawn into these graphs. I always look at where the quantity is. What haven't I been drawing into these? I don't ever identify what the new price is, right? Because it's not that I'm changing the price of the good when I'm thinking about where society's efficient point off. In fact, I could lower or increase the price to get to the same point, right? And so what I'm not going to expect you to do is I'm never going to ask you to compare society's price to the market price. Because if I model this differently, I could actually end up with both answers there, right? So that's why I'm never going to ask you about the price, because that would depend on how you model it, right? We're not going to quite touch on that issue. So I'm never going to ask you to compare society's price to the market price. That's a concept we're not going to get into. That wouldn't actually be something that's really fair of me to ask you. Now, if you use AI or something, it's probably going to spit out at you something about that. I actually was playing around with this yesterday. I'm in a course right now for understanding the back end of like generative AI tools. In fact, I was using some of them yesterday, and like if you run some of them, you get the response and you run it through another one, you'll actually be able to identify what the first one got incorrect. So there still makes a lot of errors, right? It'll start talking about prices. We're not going to do that. All I'm asking you to do when it comes to positive, negative externalities is we're comparing the quantities of the market the efficient quantity of society. Same thing with negative externalities as well. Okay? All right, so talked a lot, drew you a lot of graphs. We talked already. Taxes are kind of this market-based policy, and so are subsidies. We make the consumer or the producer internalize those additional costs and benefits. So, you know, in the example of a negative externality, if we impose a tax, producers start behaving as though that additional cost to society is their own, because we've made it their cost by increasing their cost of the tax. We can also make our consumers or producers internalize the additional benefit by giving them another benefit. What's a benefit that the government gives to either producers or consumers? When we give them money, that's a subsidy. We make them internalize these additional costs and benefits so that they start making decisions as though they have or though they face society's marginal costs and marginal benefits. Okay? So we kind of drew out those models and looked at kind of all those corrective examples that we have. I've got a kind of summary slide here. If I can get Zoom to go away. There we go. And I've got some different examples that we can kind of see. Right? So we've got taxes, we've got subsidies, kind of solve our negative positive externality issue. We won't go through kind of all these examples. We talked about a significant amount of them last class, just setting up the idea about what externalities are. So this might be kind of a good summarized, you know, reference slide for you to go back to when thinking about the combination of taxes and subsidies and positive and negative externalities. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, we're going to switch gears a little bit here, which is we want to think about different types of goods and how that relates to our externality discussion. So the first thing what we'll kind of set this up just thinking about is slightly different than what we've been looking at. So if we have the market arrive at a specific quantity, whether or not it's positive or negative externalities, we know we're not at the efficient point for society. But if we allow the people outside of the market to bargain with the people in the market, we will get to that efficient point for society. So the way to think about why, I'll kind of set up a dumb example here, and I'll maybe draw out a better way to think about it. Okay? So let's say, and I've got this guy, Dick, and he owns a dog named Spot. Right? So I've been reading these books to my son lately. He's fascinated by this dog Spot, right? So this is the owner. We'll start to think about kind of a situation set up like this. Right? So Spot barks a lot. Jane doesn't own the dog, but she has to listen. She lives right next to it. She has to listen to it bark all day. Right? So this dog is imposing an additional cost on Jane, or it's creating a negative externality. Right? So Jane's not in the market for buying or producing dogs, right? She just has to bear this additional cost. So if we want to maximize society's overall welfare or society's overall total surplus, what would this look like? Well, let's think about the different cases that could exist, right? Let's say that, just like in reality, if you own a dog, if you have the right to either keep that dog or get rid of it, right? If nobody comes to talk to you, you bought the dog for a reason, you're likely going to want to keep it. Now, this is sad, right? Maybe it should be that you would pay any amount of money to keep your dog. But let's say Dick is only willing to pay up to $500 to keep the dog, right? If the neighbor comes over and says, hey, look, I'll give you $600 if you get rid of this damn dog. He's like, well, I only liked it a little bit. I would have only like paid up to $500 to keep it. So if you're going to give me $600, I'll get rid of the dog. Now, is Jane okay with that? Well, the cost of the dog barking to her was $800. She would have paid up to $800 to get rid of this dog. She only had to offer $600 to Dick, and what happened? The dog gone. So she's had to pay an amount lower than her marginal cost, and Dick has now received an amount that was larger than his marginal benefit. So this is going to be the optimal decision for society, because why? If these were the costs and benefits that existed, if we look at this two-person society, what if the dog stays? What is total surplus? Well, the additional benefit is $500. The additional cost is $800. So total surplus would be costs are greater than the benefits. Surplus is negative. So what should society do? Get rid of the damn dog. Right? If we allow these people to bargain, I use the example of $600. That's a situation where if that amount is offered, both people will agree to get rid of the dog. We end up at the efficient point of society. Even though the person who really has the ultimate decision, who could have rejected the offer and kept the dog, is Dick. So that's kind of case one. We end up at that efficient point for society. All right. There's a range of values in the middle. You can almost think about it as, right? Dick would be willing to receive any amount that was greater than his marginal benefit of $500. Jane was incurring this additional cost of $800. So in order to get rid of the dog, she'd pay $800 or anything less. Every value in the middle here is something that's going to make Dick better off and also Jane better off. It'll lower Jane's costs, increase Dick's marginal benefit. So I chose that value right at 600, but 700 would work, 650 would work. As long as there's kind of that overlap, we know that they can come to some agreement. Now, I think in the second case that I had, we'll kind of stay here before we go to the slides. Let's say instead, Jane has the legal right to get rid of this dog. Well, it's a lot easier in this situation. So if I have the same valuations, if Jane doesn't own the dog, what's the marginal benefit of the dog to her? 0. What's the marginal cost? 800. So does she want the dog to stay? No. So if it's just up to her and she can make the decision and Dick has no say in it, she calls animal control and the dog goes away. Right? So it doesn't matter who has that right, we still end up at that efficient point for society, which is the dog is no longer the neighbor. I know, seems like a sad example, right, when we're talking about dogs, but this is a way to kind of represent that. Now, let's instead assume we have slightly different values, okay? Let's assume that the marginal benefit to Dick of owning this dog is instead 1,000. So, you know, the marginal cost to Jane is still that same $800. So we now have a dog owner who likes their dog a little bit more, right? Would pay up to $1,000 to keep it. So in order for Dick to get rid of this dog, you're going to have to offer him an amount greater than $1,000. Well, what's the highest amount that Jane is willing to pay in order to get rid of that dog? Whatever her cost is. If she pays $900, well, that's higher than her current cost of $800. So if there's no overlap, is there any amount that Jane is willing to offer that Dick is willing to accept to get rid of the dog? No. So why is this the efficient point for society now? Well, if we think about what would the total surplus be to society? It's a two-person society, so it's easier to think about, but it's the difference between the social benefits and the social costs. What's the social benefit to Dick? $1,000. What's the cost to Jane? $800. So total surplus, equal to 200, which is greater than 0. So if these were the values, should the dog stay? Yes, right? It's creating positive surplus for this two-person society. This is just kind of an easy example to show that whatever the efficient point for society is, if we allow people to bargain, we still arrive there, right? Whether or not that's the dog should stay or whether or not that's the dog should be gone. Okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Yeah.
What if it's exactly 0?
Total surplus? I like we wouldn't give an answer there, but we kind of talked about things like that in the past. If it's 0, society would be indifferent, right? So it could stay, it could go, we'd be equally as well off, right? Because if it goes, total surplus is 0, stays, total surplus is 0. So yeah, we wouldn't know, right? It could be either one. It's a good question. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So, kind of work through this example. I had these kind of 3 different cases, right? So here's kind of the children's book. We'll kind of keep moving and think about why, even if we allow people outside the market to bargain with the people in the market, why might we not end up at that efficient point for society, like in my kind of simple two-person society example, right? We won't really dive into these, but just to kind of complete the discussion. What if, like in our earlier example, a really good example this would be, so let's say in order to bargain, these neighbors hate each other, they had to pay lawyers, right? Well, now, even if there was a range in the middle where we could have come to an agreement, like that $600, if I had to pay a lawyer now $500 to get to that agreement, well, now my costs were $500 higher, that would kind of move my total cost over. Maybe now there isn't a range, right? So if we have transaction costs, a lot of time when you're bargaining, right, two parties are kind of going back and forth, they have to hire lawyers, there are transaction costs, we might not see ourselves get to that socially efficient. If people are just stubborn, right, you know, you could actually model this as though if I'm stubborn, I really just get a higher marginal benefit from getting my way, right? And so that's always going to push my marginal benefit higher, be less likely there was kind of overlap or some values we can come to an agreement on. And then we had some easy example here where there was two people. As we start to have like million people, so, you know, 350 million people societies, if everybody had to come together and agree on the exact amount of military defense that the country wants, what do you think is going to happen? Everybody has a different opinion. There's no way we're going to end up at a solution, right? And so the more people we just have coordination problems that sometimes don't allow us to get to that socially efficient. So when we think about something like military defense, we're now going to start to talk about different types of goods. Okay? So one of them is like we would call, actually, my slide's a little bit out of order here. Yeah, I want this to be, sorry. I must have accidentally moved this just to kind of make this a little bit easier. There we go. Come down here. I want to go through this in a slightly different order. So before we talk about public goods, why are public goods, right? So we have two traits of goods, and they're going to allow us to identify 4 different types of goods. So up to this point, I kind of really only looked at one when we've used examples. So most goods we were looking at were what we call excludable prior to the first debate. So if I buy my laptop, right, can anyone else buy that exact same laptop, like my physical laptop? They can buy the same version of it, but can they now have my laptop once I own it? No, right? This is my laptop. So we would call that an excludable good. As soon as I buy it, nobody else can get the marginal benefit of this specific unit. They can buy another unit and get their own mark, but they can't have the marginal benefit that exists from my specific unit that I bought. So those would be excludable goods. So this is like most things that we buy every day, right? Or I use wireless internet service here is a good one because they can't, my neighbor can't use my internet. I guess if I gave them my password and I was feeling time, right? They can't use it without my permission. It is an excludable good. Now, what is a non-excludable good? This is even though I bought this good, I can't prevent other people not from buying it, but I can't prevent other people from getting the marginal benefit. So I think of this as like, if you lived like down a dirt road and there was like 5 houses on this dirt road, if one person decides I've got to go to the car wash every day because I'm driving on this dirt road, I'm making pretty good money. You know, my car, these potholes, it's beating it up. If one of those people decides to pave that road on their own, they've bought the good, they've paved the road, but everybody else that lives on that road, what do they get? The marginal benefit of that road. I can't prevent them from using it. That was a shared road. I chose to pave it, but now everyone else gets to enjoy the marginal benefit of the fact that it's paved. Now, some other examples like I already used, was thinking about what else is a non-excludable good. Well, here it's kind of weird because the government pays for it. But every single day, do you enjoy the benefit of national defense? Yeah, because no one's buying this, right? So someone bought that good. Once it's out there, they can't prevent you from enjoying the marginal benefit, right? You every single day are enjoying the marginal benefit of the fact that national defense exists. So that's another example of kind of like a non-excludable good. Once it's out there, once one person buys it, everybody else can enjoy a marginal benefit from it. Okay? And I can't be prevented from doing that. Okay. The other characteristic of goods we're going to have are what we call rival and non-rival. So once again, most of the goods we've talked about up to this point, thinking about markets, we said they were usually excludable, things like food and clothing, etc. They were also non-rival goods. So what is a they were also rival goods, right? So what's a rival good? As soon as I buy it, right, there is one less unit out there for other people to buy. So a rival good is that once I buy a unit, there is now one less unit for other people out there to be able to buy. This is most things that we think about, right? If I buy an airline ticket, there's one fewer seats that someone can buy on that same specific route, right? But on that same airplane. Right? Or if I think about like going to Assembly Hall, if I buy a ticket to one of those seats, there's now one fewer ticket that can be sold. They're rival goods. When I buy it, there's now a lower quantity for everybody else to buy. A non-rival good, it's kind of weird, but we have more examples that are popping up the more technology we have. So if you think about like iTunes Music or Spotify, if you purchase something on those platforms, right, you purchase a song, can somebody else purchase that same song? Yes, the exact same song. You buying it doesn't affect anyone else from you. Or I'm going to age myself, what else would be a non-rival good? So if I go to Netflix or I don't know, if I go to Amazon Prime and I want to rent a movie and watch it, does that prevent anyone else from renting that same movie? No, it doesn't reduce the quantity that's available. Now, back in the day, probably you guys maybe don't have experience when you used to go to a movie store where you could rent movies. If I rent this movie and take the VHS tape home, nobody else can have that same VHS. So the same good, that movie used to be rival, but because of newer technology, it now is non-rival, right? Someone purchasing that movie on Amazon Prime doesn't prevent other people from purchasing it. So we've got these kind of two characteristics that can go either way. It's excludable or non-excludable. It's rival or non-rival. Right? So that's going to create four different categories of goods. Goods that are both excludable and rival. Those are going to be most goods that you probably think about. If I go buy a computer, nobody else can buy that same computer, right? No one else gets to. So there's now one fewer out there. It's rival. But once I buy my computer, can anybody else enjoy the market benefit from it? No, right? So it's both rival and it's excludable. Now, if I have a rival good, like let's say I want to go fish in a pond. If I catch a fish and I keep it and eat it, there is now one fewer fish for everyone else that they could using that pond. So it is rival. But if this is a kind of a pond, right, that's just out in the middle of nowhere that anybody can go fish, is it excludable? No, anyone can kind of pull up. It's in a state park or whatever it is. Anyone can kind of pull up and just start fishing, right, or fishing on a river, however you want to think about it. So rival and non-excludable goods are going to be what we call common resources, right? So, like I said, usually the examples we think of here most often going to be things like, you can almost even think about if I have Wi-Fi, technically, it's a rival good. Because when I start using bandwidth, I'm limiting how much bandwidth other people can use. So it is rival. But if we're all in here, as long as I allow you credentials, is it excludable? No. So that would be an example of a common resource. It is rival and non-excludable. So the problem we'll talk about later on with common resources is we see the tragedy that comes. If everybody hops on Wi-Fi, what's going to happen? It's all going to get bogged down, right? We get the overuse of these goods. So the other two kind of types we have, we won't really spend a lot of time on natural monopolies, but this would be an example like if you're getting internet service or cable, it's non-rival in the sense that everybody can kind of get internet service from Comcast, right? Me getting it doesn't prevent my neighbor from also getting it. But it is excludable in that my specific internet service, nobody can use what I'm paying for, right? We use the same cables, right? It's non-excludable, but my internet service I pay for, I'm the only one who can use it. So it is excludable, right? Non-rival, excludable, these kind of natural monopoly goods. Non-excludable and non-rival, these are going to be what we call public goods. Okay? So non-rival, maybe you think about like a lighthouse on a lake, right? If I'm a boat out on the ocean and I'm using this lighthouse, does that prevent anybody else from using it? There's not one fewer, right? We can all use the same lighthouse, so it's non-excludable. Or sorry, it's non-rival. Now it's non-excludable because once that lighthouse is there, why do you have to pay for it to enjoy the marginal benefit of it being there? No. In fact, an easier way, if you want to think about this excludable, non-excludable, excludable items would be things that you have to pay for. Right? You can't use it unless you pay for it. Non-excludable are going to be goods that I can use it even without paying for it. Right? Wi-Fi, a lighthouse once it's built, all of these other things. Right? We'll talk about like national defense, like public goods. Okay. So just thinking about kind of how these different characteristics can change the type of good. Let's think about one good, a road. Okay. So here, if I have, which of these would represent a public good? So a public good is non-rival and non-excludable. So I said, what's a good way to think about non-excludable? Something that I said excludable means I might have to pay to use it. Non-excludable, I don't have to pay. So if I'm thinking about a road, what would make it non-excludable? So I have it's a toll road or a non-toll road. Which one don't I have to pay for? A non-toll road. I have to drive out in 47, whatever it is. So I'm looking at if it's a public good, it's non-excludable. I don't have to pay for it. It's a non-toll road. Now, if it's a public good, it's also non-rival. So what would make this road rival? So what would me using it prevent other people from using that road if it was very congested or there was a lot of traffic? So if I'm looking for what is non-rival, I want a non-congested road. Right? So people can merge on very easily because there's not a lot of traffic. So a an uncongested non-toll road would be our public good. Look at that same good. It's a road. What would make it a common resource? So if we go back to that summary, common resources like fishing, right? Some public pond. Well, if they're rival, so when I catch a fish, no one else can catch that same fish. So if it's a rival road, that means when I use it, I'm preventing other people from using it. So that would be a heavily trafficked or congested road. A common resource, we said anyone can go fish this pond, it is non-excludable. You don't have to pay to do it. Which road do I not have to pay to use? A non-toll road. We can kind of keep walking through this. What would be a private good? All right, so it's private good, we said, is both rival and excludable. So which of these do I have to pay for, or which one is excludable? A toll road. Which of these would be rival? Me using it prevents other people from using it. A congested. And then the only one that we don't have is a natural monopoly, where we said those are going to be non-rival and excludable. So once again, this word excludable, think of it as though I have to pay for it. So which of these is going to be rival? Which road do you have to pay to use? Toll road. What would make it, let's exclude it, What would make it non-rival? So it's excludable, it's a toll road, but what would make it non-rival? Me using it didn't prevent other people, so it'd be a toll road, but an uncongested or less traffic toll road. So the same good, if those characteristics about that road changed, we could see it be a different type of good. Okay. So with public goods, we're going to talk about an issue that kind of exists here. So if I have a public good, we kind of already went through this discussion, it's going to be both non-excludable and non-rival. So let's say, putting easy numbers here, I don't know, maybe these is in thousands or something, but let's say like if I want to hire a police officer, it's, I don't know, $35 an hour or something like that, right? Well, if I think about it, there's one person society, Tom, how many police officers on his own would he choose to hire? Maybe he's got tons of businesses in the area. He wants to keep them safe. If he's hiring like private companies to kind of police these areas, how many is he going to want to hire? Well, what's the marginal cost? If I hire these police officers, it's the price I pay, $35. How many police officers will I, this is back to like module 1. So I would hire an officer as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So how many would Tom hire? Hire the first, hire the second, not hire the third. So we would have 2. Now, that's not our efficient point for society when we look at public goods. Right? So why? Because even if I think about a simple two-person society, if I look at Jill, if she's making a decision, how many police officers would she hire? If the cost is 35, how many would she hire? 0. Right? Even that first officer, the marginal benefit to her is less than the marginal cost. However, what's the total benefit to society? I would add up the marginal benefit of every person in society. Here it's a simple two-person society, but my marginal social benefit of that first officer is 80, second is 65, etc. So if I want to identify the socially efficient number of officers in this two-person society, how many should society hire? Well, will that hire the first? 80 is greater than 35, yes. Is 65 greater than 35? Yes. Is 50 greater than 35? Yes. Is 35 greater than? No, but what do? We choose to do something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to. We go up to that point where it's equal. So the efficient point for society is 4, but if we allow these individuals to make their decision on their own, we're only going to end up with Tom hiring 2, Jill not hiring any. Right? So this is the idea that a police officer is really a public good once it's paid for. Why? Because it's non-excludable. Right? Once that police officer is out there, everybody in the society enjoys the marginal benefit. Right? Now it's a public good in reality because no one person hires police officers, our government does. Right? So it's not like you're paying directly for the police. You might pay for it in taxes, but you're not paying for it directly, so it's non-rival, non-excludable. It's kind of this public good. Okay. So what do we see with public goods? We drew it out earlier. What must exist? If I'm getting too little of something, I was getting 2 instead of the efficient point for society of 4, what type of externality results in the quantity of the market being lower? We said if the market doesn't factor in additional benefits, it's going to choose a quantity that is too low. So what do public goods have? Positive externalities. Right? Once that police officer is hired, other people enjoy the marginal benefit of them being out there. There are positive externalities. So our public goods are just a very unique case of thinking about positive externalities that exist. Okay. So, we can kind of go through. This is kind of a fluff slide. We won't waste time on this, just given where we're at. So what can happen with these public goods? Well, if once that police officer is out there, everybody else gets to kind of enjoy the benefit, what might I hope? So if I don't want to hire the officer, I hope that someone else does. Because once they're hired, even though I didn't pay for them, I get to enjoy the benefits. But if everybody thinks that way, everybody is hoping somebody else pays for that police officer. How many police officers get hired? None. That's going to be way below the efficient point for society. I always think about it in the context of a class. You might have a question. Marginal benefit, if you ask a question and I answer it, is that excludable? First of all, do you have to pay to ask the question? No. So once you've asked it and I answer it, anybody else, it's not excludable. They can use it, right? It's free to them. It's also non-rival. You hearing the answer doesn't prevent everybody else in the room from hearing the answer. So it's a public good. But even though there might be a marginal benefit to you of me answering your question, what is there? A high social cost maybe to you of looking dumb, right? That might be the way you think about it, but you shouldn't think about it that way, right? Because if everybody thinks that way, what happens? Nobody asks me a damn question. In which case, what is our quantity? 0, way away from that efficient point. Okay? So with public goods, we can sometimes have this idea of the free rider problem. We're all hoping that somebody else asks the question, or we're all hoping that somebody else pays for the police officer. Okay? So what's the result? We don't get enough of this good. We have the positive externality issue. Okay? So national defense, firefighters, I was using police officers, maybe scientific research. So what ends up happening? Nobody can, I'll show you it in a slightly different way. So I think I have like a slide open for here. Yeah, so this cost benefit analysis. So let's think maybe about a more complicated example as to what we can do to fix this problem with public goods. So in the most extreme case, and this was like, I think it was Jill that I had in the other one, what's the cost of national defense? insanely high. So if I think about the supply curve, it's going to be way up here, right? For me to produce national defense, it's very expensive to buy tanks, right? Air carrier, these crazy missiles. So for any one person, what's my ability? Remember, demand is the ability and willingness to pay. Do I have the ability to fund national defense? No, right? The only person probably who fits in that category would be like Elon Musk or someone, right? So every individual's demand curve is like way down here. So if I think about there's 2 people in here, there's 3 people's demand curves, maybe there's a 4th right here. For any one individual, does their demand curve, where would it intersect supply? Out here at a negative value. So will anybody be able to pay for national defense? No. But what is marginal social benefit? When I was doing that in the table, to find the social benefit, I was adding up each individual's marginal benefit at that quantity. Well, instead of 2 people, if I think about the entire country, I'd be adding up the demand curve of every single person. So my marginal social benefit to having national defense is way up here. If the social benefit is above the private marginal benefits, I have a positive externality. So society wants the quantity to be way out here for national defense. Every single person can't pay for it. So the market ends up at 0. We're way below the efficient point for society, or we have underproduction, which will cause deadweight loss. So public goods are really just an extreme example of really large positive externalities. Okay. So how can I fix this problem? What do I need to increase the quantity in this market? I need to use subsidies, right? So how, this is where it gets kind of complicated. And this is just more of a real world kind of taking what we're talking about and put it in a real world context. Well, how is the government, or how is the national defense paid for? It's subsidized by the government. But where does the government get the money to subsidize national defense? It taxes all of us. Because it knows all of us have some marginal benefit to this good existing. We just don't have the ability to buy it on our own. So we'll subsidize the national defense, right? The government pays for it. But how do we pay for that subsidy, that government expenditure we talked about? We would then have to go to different markets and tax people, right? Collect government or tax revenue to then pay for these subsidies of public goods. Okay. All right, so we got 15 minutes left here. I want to make sure we get through some of this. So here was kind of, I'm thinking about public goods as positive externalities and kind of connecting it to that what we talked about earlier. I can use subsidies to fix that issue. So common resources are going to be a little bit different, right? So this was kind of my example of if I'm having a pond and anybody can go fish, it's not exclusive. You don't have to pay to go fish in this pond. But when I catch a fish, I keep it, eat it, nobody else can catch that same fish. So it's rival and non-exclusive. So what's going to happen if you have a free pond? Everybody who likes to fish is going to go fish that pond. If they fish it enough, can the fish populate and replace themselves? No. So what happens if everyone fishes this pond? The fish go, oh wait, there's no more fish left. So what do we get? We get the overuse of this good. What did we say causes the market to overuse or arrive at a point that's too high? Whenever we had negative externalities. When I catch fish, it stops them from repopulating as quickly, which lowers, right? Or kind of, there's fewer fish for people to catch, or everyone else's kind of costs are now going up, right? There's fewer of them to be able to catch. And so now they can't catch a fish. I've imposed a cost. There are negative externalities. So with common resources, right, we get this kind of, instead of the free rider problem, we call it the tragedy of the commons. So I have that kind of here, right? So I say that it's overused. There we go. Tragedy of the commons, right? People overfish the ocean. They overfish these ponds. This was happening with bluefin tuna for a while. The population was getting lower and lower. There was a huge negative externality. Everybody fishes this specific type of fish. It eventually goes away. Now, if no one can catch it, there's a huge cost to society because we have no more fish being able to be eaten. Right? So this is the idea of tragedy of the commons. We get the overuse of this good. So another example, and this is something I'm a little bit less common or a little bit less knowledgeable about, like out Utah and Wyoming, there are like public lands where you can just take your cattle to graze, right? So what happens? If I don't have to pay for it, what does everybody in the area do? Take their cattle to graze that land. Well, if everyone's bringing their cattle there, what does that land eventually become? Dirt, right? There's no longer a free public land where I can, so what have I done? I've created a huge cost to society, or this huge negative externality from the overuse of this good. So I've got an example here. I want to go through quickly, right? Where we can kind of think about this in two contexts. Right? So usually, and I'll kind of draw this out, you'll have the reference in the slide, but I think this will help connect some dots a little bit better. So we said, if I have a common resource, so the market is going to arrive at this quantity and this price. We said with a common resource, so public goods, we had positive externalities. With a common resource, when I start fishing this pond, I'm causing fewer people to be able to fish it. I'm imposing costs on people outside this market. So I have a negative externality. Now, we usually said I would kind of draw that negative externality through the supply curve. It's an additional cost. So what happened? The efficient point for society was down here. So the fact that we were overusing, the cost to society were greater than the marginal benefits, and we had this deadweight loss created. This is exactly what we drew out earlier. With common resources, it's sometimes easier to think about it this way, but once again, if you don't want to, you don't have to model it this way. I think it's easier to model common resources as a negative externality, which they have, and model it through the supply curve. But because I have a little bit of time, I want to show you that you can model it through the demand. And maybe with common resources, it'll make sense as to why we might want to do that. So if I've got my supply curve, all right, and just to kind of reiterate here, because we only have negative externalities, here was my marginal social benefit. I was the same as demand. So once I have here, I've got my private marginal benefits, private marginal cost. Try to draw these to be at the same point. I'm a little bit off here, right? But here's where the market starts. If I have a negative externality, we're usually drawing that as an additional cost, so we added it to the supply curve. The supply curve representing costs. If people are overfishing a pond, what happens to the marginal benefit of the consumers who want to fish that pond? It goes down. So I can actually model negative externalities as though they lower consumers' marginal benefits, or they decrease my demand curve. So if I think about it, I take the demand curve, the marginal benefits, and I add in this external cost, which if I add it in, it's negative, so it actually lowers my demand curve. Notice, what do I get? The efficient point for society is down here. It tells me the exact same thing, that the market is arriving at a quantity that is too high. So it doesn't matter if I model it through the supply or demand curve, it'll both lead me to seeing the market is producing a quantity that's too high. And where is the deadweight loss here? Well, it's the difference between here I didn't model it through the supply curve, so my marginal cost or society's marginal cost. Here, my marginal social benefit, or this kind of like new demand curve, marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost here. The difference between those two, I would kind of have this as my total surplus, but because the market is overproducing, that difference between my marginal social cost and my marginal social benefit, I end up with the same deadweight loss as before. So it doesn't matter how I model it, I'll find the same results. That I've created deadweight loss, I've seen that the market overproduces, that was creating that deadweight loss. And sometimes with common resources, it makes a little bit more sense because we're really thinking about when I overfish a pond, I'm not really imposing costs on the producers of fish. I'm imposing that cost on people trying to consume that. Now, once again, it doesn't matter how you model it, you get the same results. So if it makes it easier on the quiz and the exam, you only have to model it this way, and you could answer any single question I ask. If you did model it this way, you could still find the same results, right? It's just, why have you kind of have to do it multiple ways? It's just easier to remember. I can always draw negative externalities for common resources through my supply curve. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So here's kind of a unique example where it's a little bit different. So if I did model it through my demand curve, it isn't always that there's a linear shift. Now, I'm only ever going to give you linear shifts, but it's kind of interesting in the case of like common resources. Initially, when people start fishing this pond, the fish can still kind of repopulate. Not as quick of a rate, but they can. But as more and more people fish, or there's more and more boats in this pond or the ocean fishing, what happens? The rate at which fish can repopulate starts to get lower and lower. The marginal change in the rate they can repopulate is increasing. So sometimes our positive externalities aren't the same at every single unit. Sometimes as we are producing more, the size of that negative externality is growing, right? That difference between my marginal benefit, marginal social benefit, that difference was the external cost. For common resources, often that external cost, it's not the same per unit. As we increase the number of units, that external cost or the value of the negative externality is getting larger and larger. You could think about it also this way. If I throw some trash on the ground, well, if just one person does that, what's the external cost? Pretty small. But as more and more people just start throwing their trash on the ground, eventually we look like we live in a landfill. What's the external cost to society now? Really, really large. It wasn't the same per unit. It was actually increasing as more and more people chose to throw trash on the ground. Kind of a weird example there, thinking about the market for throwing your trash on the ground, but that's one way you kind of think about it, right? We don't need to dive into this. This is if we had kind of time. Once again, if I have positive externalities with public goods, we said we could subsidize them. If I have negative externalities with common resources, what's one solution? I could tax it, right? Or I can impose quotas. So like when it comes to like hunting, you have to pay for a deer tag, right? Or if it comes to, fishing, you're technically supposed to like buy a fishing license, right? People legally don't, but right? Legally you have to. What is that? You're basically just paying a tax to be able to fish or to be able to hunt, right? So why are we doing that? Because we want to impose these costs so that we are fixing that negative externality issue. Okay. So given where we're at on time, kind of drew this out for us. This is just kind of some fluff stuff, just thinking about some different examples. So anything that you would kind of need for the quiz, we've kind of covered in class this week. In terms of the in-class quiz, right, all of you are going to get lucky here. So before you open it, so don't open it up yet. I'm going to change this to make sure that there's plenty of time to kind of get this in on your way out. So the number is going, now you can open it. The number is going to be 20.17. Okay. So 20.17, just answer the questions, put any answer in there. There'll be good questions you can kind of go back and review. As long as you answer the questions and hit submit before you get out of here, I think I even had it set to be 9:18, so you got a little bit of time there. I'll go back in later this afternoon, and as long as you submit an answer to those questions, I'll give you full credit for every question. Now, it's going to probably show up as though you might have missed it or got it wrong in the meantime, but I will get those updated later this afternoon once I get back to my office, so that as long as you answer the 2 questions, you will get full credit. 20.17. Good work. I'm working for people there. Hope I'm doing this good from memory. Yes. Okay. So answer those questions. Get it submitted before you leave. Other than that, CL sessions tonight. I've got office hours on Monday, CL sessions on Monday. As you're preparing for this quiz, try to stay warm, have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.